I'm incredibly excited to officially announce my new book. It's called Arithmophobia, an anthology of mathematical horror, and it features some of the best horror writers in the world. Stick around and I'll tell you all about it. Okay, I know what some of you are thinking. A math book? Well, yeah, and I'll explain why in just a minute. But before I lose half of my audience, let me just say right at the start, this book is both for people who love math and for those who are terrified by it. So don't run away or switch the video off just yet. This is the latest book from my new publishing house, Polymath Press, and honestly, I couldn't be more excited for y'all to get a chance to read it. I have in my hands right here the very first copy. In fact, so far this is the only copy in existence of this particular book, because it's my publisher's proof copy. But the book will be making its way to bookstores and to readers very soon. It's currently at the printer, it's on its way, it's coming. In fact, it's currently available for pre-order directly from me at the Polymath Press website, and there's a link down in the What's It where you can find that. And I do have autographed copies available there, so if you'd like me to sign one for you, you can get it directly from me. But it's also available for pre-order pretty much wherever books are sold, both in this paperback format and as an ebook. And so when's it coming out? I mentioned it's a pre-order. It's coming on the most appropriate day in all the year for a book like this, Pi Day. That's March 14th, or 3/14, in case you didn't know. So, as I record this, and as many of you will see this, that's just a few weeks away, and that's also, of course, the reason I'm wearing my Pi t-shirt this particular evening. So, to let you know what this book is all about, let's start by just reading the description off the back, shall we? It says, Arithmophobia, noun, the fear of numbers or mathematics. Whether you love mathematics or find it terrifying, this anthology of original tales of terror is sure to send a chill down your spine. With an unlucky 13 brand new horror stories, and a bonus poem in case any readers suffer from triskaidekaphobia, these pages combine the talents of some of the genre's most experienced, award-winning practitioners of terror, and some of the literary world's most promising new voices. Featuring contributions by... I'm going to skip that for now because I'm going to go through all of them in just a moment. Then it carries on to say, these stories tell us of strange and horrifying new geometries, crazed and violent mathematicians, sentient and malevolent numbers, and even some new mathematical twists on some classic monsters. You needn't be a mathematician to experience these new forms of mathematical terror, though students of the discipline might recognize some familiar names and ideas lurking in the shadows. So, pull up a chair, dust off your abacus and slide rule, and prepare to experience Arithmophobia. So, I think that gives you a good sense of it, but it might also leave you with a question. Why in the world would anyone be crazy enough to publish an anthology of math horror? I mean, that can't possibly be the widest literary market in the world, and that's probably true. I suspect there are plenty of people who might be turned off by the idea of math, but I hope they're not, because like I said, you don't really need to be a mathematician to get this book. There are references to math, and there are things that mathematicians will notice and will enjoy, but I specifically selected stories, and I intended this anthology to be accessible and good and wonderful, both for the PhD level mathematician and for the complete, well, arithmophobe. The honest truth of the matter is, this is sort of a pet project for me. Ever since I was working on my degree in math, I've been looking for good mathematical horror. Even back then, I was a horror nerd, and as I was becoming more and more a math nerd, I was looking to combine them. And there is some math horror out there. Lovecraft himself wrote some, as you may recall if you've seen my video on Lovecraftian mathematics and non-Euclidean geometry. And again, there's a link down in the What's It in case you missed that video. But the fact of the matter is, though some mathematical horror stories do pop up here and there from time to time, there's just not all that much. Sci-fi horror, yes. Math horror, not so much. And so this is really the book that I have wanted to read for more than a decade at this point. And since I personally seem to be the only guy crazy enough to actually edit and publish something like an anthology of mathematical horror, here we are. And because this is a pet project for me, I'm really hoping all of you will give it a chance, even if math isn't ordinarily your thing. Partly because I invested a lot of time and money into an admittedly niche market kind of a book, and I desperately need people to read it. But mostly because I honestly do really genuinely think it's a great book. And on some level, I feel like I can get away with saying that because even though it's my book, I edited it, my name's on the cover, the stories are not mine. I picked stories that I genuinely believe in. When I invited authors and made an open call for submissions, I was blown away by the number of truly amazing stories that people send in. Of course, not all of them, but the fact of the matter is, I had to reject a lot of great stuff because I just ended up with so much more than I had space for. Which means the stories we do have in this book are amazing. To really sell you on this book, I'm going to take a minute to look at each of the stories individually. Don't worry, no spoilers here, just a little tease of what these stories are going to be about. First up is 1-2 Buckle My Shoe by Elizabeth Massie, who, if you haven't read her work yet, you're really in for a real treat. She's won a bunch of awards, including multiple Bram Stoker awards, and was the Horror Writers Association Lifetime Achievement Award winner for 2022. She's also written everything from short stories to novels to nonfiction, including media tie-ins like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, Power of Persuasion, and is the creator of the children's or middle grade Emeris Scares series that's introducing young people to the frightening things in each and every state of the United States, which seems like a worthy cause to me. So I'm thrilled that her story opens this anthology. It's the story of a person who's rather obsessed with mathematics, likes to count things, likes to perform odd little statistics experiments. In fact, those statistical experiments reminded me a little bit of my own honors thesis in mathematics, but that's neither here nor there because, as we all know, this is a horror story, and, well, if you're afraid of mathematics, this one might make you also afraid of those of us who like mathematics. And then there's Splinters by Miguel Fliguer and Mike Slater. Miguel is from Argentina, and he's written tons of short stories and collaborations, including more than just this one with Mike Slater. He's also the author of Cooking with Lovecraft. His co-author, Mike, speaking of Lovecraftian cookbooks, is the author of the Necro Nom Nom Nom, which you might actually remember as one of my recommendations for holiday gifts this past Christmas season. He's also written a few other cookbooks along similar lines, and both of them are frequent collaborators with each other and are both involved with Red Duke Games. Their story, Splinters, is a really interesting one. Miguel said it's one of the darkest that they've ever written, and I believe it. It's not particularly violent or a gore fest or anything. It's more of an intellectual kind of a horror. But if you really think about some of the ideas in this story, I think you'll have some sleepless nights. It's written in the form of a professor giving a lecture to an audience. He starts off talking about fractal geometry and dimensions that aren't just our usual three of length, width, and height, and aren't even the extra dimensions that physicists have been talking about, the fourth dimension of time, or even extra spatial dimensions, or the many curled up tiny little dimensions involved in string theory. But in this story, we're also talking about non-integer dimensions, dimensions between our usual three somehow. And from those admittedly strange mathematical ideas, we're off to the races with a philosophical discussion that leads us right into the heart of Lovecraftian terror. And let's just say, I'm absolutely in favor of any horror story that's not afraid to quote both Lovecraft and Solzhenitsyn. Then we turn to Manifold Thoughts by Patrick Freivald. Patrick is a 4-time Bram Stoker Award nominee, beekeeper, hot sauce maker, and, of relevance to us here, physics teacher. When he and I were first discussing this anthology, he said he was having a hard time thinking of a story for it. Not because he hates math. On the contrary, he was struggling because he said math is beautiful rather than scary. And on that, I agree. Just because math is beautiful, though, doesn't mean it can't reveal some rather scary things to us. It's actually how I feel about horror as well. Some of it can be really beautiful even as it takes the time to scare the bejesus out of us. But Patrick did eventually find just the right idea. And that idea led to this story. The idea is, what if mathematical constructs like manifolds aren't just mental abstractions that mathematicians use when they're making their calculations, and not even just abstractions that we use to understand objects or entities in physical reality, but what if they're actually sentient entities? And if they're sentient, and if we could come up with a way to communicate with them, what might they say and do to us? Our next story is Real Numbers by Liz Kaufman, a Canadian author who says she likes to blend a variety of genres together, which is something I always like to see, personally. I didn't call my publishing house Polymath Press for nothing. This story actually starts from a similar idea to Patrick's. What if numbers are real? But instead of going in the direction of mathematical physics and the study of applied geometry, this one takes us right into the dark wood, so to speak, of mathematical philosophy. As a student, upon hearing a lecture on mathematical realism versus anti-realism, becomes convinced that numbers actually are real entities, and that some of them are malevolent. It's not much of a spoiler to say it's the odd numbers you've got to watch out for in this particular story, which was rather distressing to me when I first read it because I'm the kind of weirdo who only eats vegetables in prime numbers, and there's only just the one even prime. And then there's Aatosan Map by Damon Nomad, who trained as both an engineer and as a lawyer, and he's also published 2 novels called Phantom in the Desert and A Dangerous Test. His story combines mathematics, history, and religion in some interesting ways. And y'all know I'm a nerd for all 3 of those things, so this story was right up my alley. It follows a group of mathematicians trying to use number theory, which is the study of the integers, and things like the prime numbers. They're using number theory in order to unlock the religious secrets of an ancient map created by Eratosthenes of Cyrene. He was a real ancient Greek mathematician who lived about 2,300 years ago or so. He was the head librarian at Alexandria, but is best remembered today as perhaps the first, and certainly the first that we know about, mathematician to correctly measure the circumference of the Earth. And he did that by measuring the shadows of sticks in two different cities far apart, knowing the distance between them, measuring the angles of those shadows, and then applying what math students today would consider fairly basic trigonometry, but then was fairly cutting edge, and used this mathematics to accurately measure the size and the circumference of the Earth. He was only a couple percent off using sticks as his measuring tools, and he was still only a couple percent off of what we, with all of our space-age technology, have been able to determine is the real number. Anyway, getting back to the story, in the tale, he's left a map that's been rediscovered, and this map might lead directly to a place where one can access the afterlife. Next is They'll Say It Was the Communists by Sarah Lazarz. I've never seen her work anywhere else before, but after reading this one, I think we're all going to be seeing a lot more of her work in the near future. This story also takes us into history, but this time it's more recent history, the space race. It begins with something absolutely true. At that time, during the space race, NASA employed legions of women as what they called computers. We're not talking about the electronic machines, we mean computers as in people who compute. These women were responsible for computing or calculating the massive numbers of equations and other calculations that had to be numbers crunched and equations solved in order to get human beings into space before the Soviets could do the same. But in this story, some of them, once accepted into a more secret department within the space program, have started acting strangely, zombie-like, so to speak. The story becomes something of a terrifying mystery as we as readers join some of the characters, and one character in particular, in trying to figure out what's really going on. And of course, as usual, it's not just a great story, but one that's right up my own alley because space race history is another favorite subject of mine. That's followed by Martin Zeigler's story called Trains Passing. Martin is an author who specializes in short stories in the mystery, sci-fi, and horror genres, and has published 2 collections of his short fiction, as well as plenty of works in a variety of anthologies and literary magazines. He also, he told me when we were working on the story, he likes to dabble in some unsolved problems in number theory, which is also a hobby that I've been known to share with him from time to time myself. I occasionally like to sit with some pencil and paper or at my blackboard, pour myself either a cup of coffee or perhaps an adult beverage, depending on the particular problem that I'm working on, and beat my head against the kinds of things that far better mathematicians than myself have beat their heads against for, in some cases, many decades or even centuries without a solution. Anyway, getting back to the stories, in the story, we don't get any unsolved problems in number theory. Instead, we get a real classic of a math problem. Say you've got 2 trains headed toward each other at 400 and 440 miles per hour. If they start 1,260 miles apart, when do they pass each other? We've all seen these problems on our various algebra exams back in the day. Some of us found them interesting, some of us found them dreadful, but regardless of whether you enjoyed those problems or not, in this story, which is the most explicitly comedic of the bunch, although there's some humor in plenty of the others, in this story, that problem, that trains passing problem, comes to life, so to speak, in some interesting ways. And yes, I double-checked the author's algebra, and yes, he gives the correct solution to the problem within the story. Next is Asymmetrical Dreams by Josh Snider, a young writer from a family of writers who also had a story in my previous anthology, In the Woods, a Fiction Foundry anthology, which y'all should also check out if you haven't done so already. But in this one, we follow a math professor who's rather obsessed with symmetry. Fair enough as far as I'm concerned. If you're going to be OCD as a mathematician, symmetry seems like a perfectly good obsession to have. I'm rather fond of it myself. But as the story opens, he finds these these unusual books that exhibit a seemingly supernatural kind of symmetry between them. And that drags him right down the rabbit hole into the kind of terror you'll only find in a mathematical horror anthology. And that's followed by Critical Mass by Rivka Crowbourne, an author I don't actually know a ton about, whose description on the About the Author page says only, "An aspiring poet and writer who wishes you infinitely well." This is somebody I've never read before, but I have a feeling that we're going to be seeing the name Rivka Crowbourne some more in the future if this story is any indication. The story itself features two of my very favorite things: mathematics and werewolves. If you've never wondered about the math behind classic monsters, you will wonder about it after you've read this story. And if you have wondered, you'll get at least some of the answers you've been looking for. I don't really want to say much more because it's a pretty short story. It's the shortest of the stories in the anthology. And saying much more than that would give away, I think, a little too much. But yeah, lycanthropic mathematics may just be the hot new subgenre we never knew we needed. Then we turn to Lost and Found by Joe Stout, a Tennessee-based author of short stories who likes to spend some time in the mountains. Combine that pastime with the horror genre, and we end up with a great opening for a horror story. This horror story, as a matter of fact. A man lost in the woods on a mountain. But he doesn't stay completely lost for very long. He happens across the home of this, let's say, reclusive, retired math teacher who intends to give him the math exam of and for his life. The math exam itself takes us through a bunch of math problems and math trivia, and it was great to see so many diverse mathematical ideas referenced relatively briefly, but all in one place. And I was pleasantly surprised to find that one of them had to send me running off to my math library to find the answer, because even I, and I'm not the best mathematician in the world, but I do read a lot of math and a lot of math history, and I do have a degree in it, and even I didn't know the answer to one of these math trivia questions. I won't spoil too much, but I'll just say the answer that I had to look up was the word Zinzik, and you'll understand the question after you've read the story. But though I won't say too much more about it, I will say that both Joe Stout and I are filing that particular word and trivia question away in our respective pub trivia repertoires. And as for the story itself, well, if you're one of those who was always afraid of your math classes and your math teachers and your math exams, that might be one of the stories for you, because that's a pretty scary math exam. Next, we have A Strange Thing Happened at the Coffee Shop by Brian Knight. His might be a familiar name to those of you who've been around this channel for a while, because I've known him and his work for, as much as I pain to admit how old I am, decades at this point, and I'm always happy to recommend what he's written. He's the author of novels like Feral, Hacks, and the Phoenix Girls series, as well as a wonderful collection of short stories, which I've recommended on this channel before, called Dragonfly. In his short story, we begin with an observation whose truth I think we can all agree and acknowledge. That observation is that reality, the universe, is governed by mathematical law. But this story asks what might happen if someone or something were to start trying to tinker or monkey with those fundamental equations at the heart of the universe itself. Next, we have Solve for X by Will Forbis. He's a relative newcomer to the literary world, but I think his is going to be a name a lot of people will recognize very soon. He recently published his novel called What Waits in the Shadows, but in this anthology, his story tells us of a young student struggling with mathematics. See, like I said, not all these stories are about mathematicians. Some of them are specifically about how hard math is and how much of a struggle people have with it. Anyway, this particular student's math tutor has gone missing, and foul play is suspected, but no one seems to know anything. But our young hero thinks he may have found a way to use his math tutor's last lesson to solve her disappearance. If you like mystery horror with just a hint of the supernatural, this is going to be one that I think you'll particularly enjoy. And then there's A Presence Beyond the Shadows by David Lee Summers. He's an author of numerous books and short stories. The one I read most recently was called The Astronomer's Crypt, which is about a supernatural terror at an astronomical observatory. And in fact, that novel rings particularly true because David works at an observatory when he's not writing. I met him at a convention, and knowing that astronomers tend to know a thing or two about mathematics, suggested he might want to send me a story for this anthology. He did so, and the result was A Presence Beyond the Shadows. It's another one that focuses heavily on mathematical physics and higher-order dimensions. We're used to seeing in 3 spatial dimensions, right? Up, down, left, right, front, back. Our usual 3 spatial dimensions. But physicists tell us there are others, even though they're notoriously difficult to wrap your head around. A physicist of my own acquaintance once confided in me that he only ever managed to actually mentally visualize a 4th spatial dimension while under the influence of the kind of substances of which I don't approve. But never mind that, getting back to the story, that's where we start off. Our main character is a scientist and mathematician who's invented a pair of goggles you can wear, and they allow the user to see a sort of projection of the 4th spatial dimension. But when he uses those goggles to investigate what his wife thinks might be a haunting at their house, things turn in a predictably terrifying direction. That's the last of the short stories, but we're not quite done. That's a perfect, horrifyingly unlucky 13 short stories. But when I was putting this together, I knew 2 things sort of about the number of works to include. First, I knew that there should be 13 stories, because 13 is prime, it's considered unlucky, it's the subject of superstition and horrifying things, and it seemed right for an anthology of mathematical horror. But second, I knew that if I wanted to publish a math anthology, I couldn't risk scaring off those with triskaidekaphobia, or the fear of the number 13. So I felt like I needed something extra, and the perfect solution came along when Maxwell I. Gold sent his poem, The Ghosts of the Spiral. Maxwell is a multiple award-nominated author and poet, and one of the movers and shakers in the Horror Writers Association, and I'm particularly pleased and excited to announce, as of yesterday as of when I'm filming this at least, he is now officially a nominee for this year's Bram Stoker Award in the poetry category. So, of course, my congratulations to him for that. First of all, whether he wins or not, we won't know for a few months, but even being nominated is quite an accomplishment with that particular award. As for the specific poem in this anthology, it's what's known as a Fibonacci poem. In such a poem, the number of syllables in each line is determined by the Fibonacci sequence, which starts with 0 and 1, and then each next term is the sum of the previous 2. So it goes 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8, 13, and so forth. It famously produces a spiral shape and is related to the famous so-called golden ratio, which comes up in mathematics and art and biology and all over the place. In this case, we get a kind of double Fibonacci poem because it repeats that pattern of following the Fibonacci sequence twice, and it describes the eternal and looping descent into a horrifying spiral. It seemed like it would be the perfect way to close out such an amazing anthology of mathematical horror. So that's my new anthology. I genuinely hope you all think it sounds as exciting, or at least almost as exciting as I do. And not just because I'm trying to sell you a copy, but I honestly believe these are great stories, and I would love them to find the audience they deserve. And of course, I look forward to hearing from any of you who do read it, either in online reviews or in the comments here on this channel. I'm always interested to hear what people think about things that I've written, or in this case, things that I've edited. As a reminder, the book is currently available for pre-order at Polymath Press, where I'm happy to hook you up with an autographed copy if you want one of those. And it's also available for pre-order from fine booksellers everywhere, or if not available now, at least about to become so, depending on which particular bookshop you're looking at. As always, the relevant links are down in the What's It, so you can find a copy of the book and find all of the important information you need to know. So now, I'll bring this video to a close by repeating what I said earlier. Pull up a chair, dust off your abacus and your slide rule, and prepare to experience arithmophobia. And of course, I will add, as always, take care and stay scared.